Hello, everyone. Welcome to As It Were, a podcast about research stories that we find interesting. We're your hosts, Max.
Nick,
And Otto.
The New York Times described his arrival on December 6th, 1851, as an event the world seldom beholds. That morning, guards repelled a mob to allow him to board a boat to cross from Staten Island. For the next hour, he toured the harbor, battery salutes from merchant ships and shore batteries following the entire time. A massive throng anxiously waited for Manhattan's guest. To jubilant cheering, he bowed to the people of New York. Stepping off the boat, his entourage wore felt hats with feathers stuck into them, mistakenly taken as gifts from a New York City hatter who had tried selling them on board. They were ushered inside Castle Garden, a fort in southern Manhattan with a varied history, ranging from an event venue to the point of customs before the more famous Ellis Island. Mayor Ambrose Kingsland greeted him. Castle Garden only stands on 1 acre of land, but on that day was packed with up to 10,000 spectators. The foundations vibrated under the weight of the crowd. If anyone could hear it, a band struck Hail to the Chief, the song traditionally used to announce the appearance of the American president. The crowd was impossible to contain, drowning out Kingland's opening. The guest shouted, "Oh, it's impossible, Mr. Mayor," and offered to give his notes to the press. The crowd refused to see him go, so he tried once more. This time his words caused a mob to push forward, seeking to seize him and his wife in excitement. They made their escape through a rear door, but not before a woman clipped a piece of his coat as memento. So, do you have any idea who I'm talking about?
not in the least right now.
Nope. No idea.
I am trying to make this out from this very generic 1800s looking man statue that you have before me, but this could be one of any Civil War generals that I've seen, or pretty much any white dignitary of the era.
I'm just trying to think of what Giga Chat out there is on a boat that just takes a dude's felt hat thinking it's a gift instead of paying for it.
Well, you definitely get the personality of the who will do that soon. And I think you're right that the statue that I have for you is like one of the most generic 1800s people you could see.
Yeah, I mean the beard is reminiscent of Napoleon III, with that kind of Van Dyke beard look to him, but his part is identical to any number of politicians I've seen from this era, as is his coat and style. So it's indicative of the time, but not necessarily of anything else.
hmm
His statue is made from the same material of other statues from the era.
I had no idea who this guy was before researching this topic either, but I think as my introduction showed that I found a great gem of a story. I think he might actually be the most famous person in his time that relatively nobody cares about in 2025. Well, I shouldn't say no one, since I'm talking about Lajos Kossuth, a Hungarian noble and national hero known for leading the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. So now that I say his name at all, have you heard of him? He's sometimes also Louis Kossuth.
I
Nope.
cannot say that I know who this fellow is.
That's exactly my point. Is I have never heard of this guy before, and that's how much people celebrated him when he entered New York City.
I mean,
I
for what
guess
it,
this Hungarian Revolution was a big deal.
I'm going to say for what it's worth, like, what would my knowledge of this fellow be in America aside from him arriving very in such a celebrated
hmm
way? Like, it's not like, for example, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was a military engineer who served in the Revolution. Like, that's something we learn about, particularly in upstate New York. But like, that is not something I would expect to learn about
I
otherwise.
was about to say, who is we? And then you specified upstate New York.
So I'll get into more of his sort of legacy and importance later, but that's fair from what I've given you. So, this story is a fun one that traces back and forth across the Atlantic world. Among other events, we'll see an attempt at legal revolution, possibly the cattiest diplomatic letters ever written, and the nicest thing anyone has ever said about Ohio.
Oh, did these get cattier than like the King of Sparta?
Oh, that's I mean that's a good one, but just because they're more long and drawn out, and for the entire duration they are, I'll say yes. Before I begin, I'll list off my sources. As this is a podcast, I won't be going through every page number I get everything from, but I think that it's still important to give credit. So, my secondary sources are Wages, Prices, and Living Standards in the Habsburg Empire by Thomas Shevchenko, Lawful Revolution by Istvan Diak, Imperial Borderlands by Bogdan Popescu, Lajos Kossuth and Young America by Donald Spencer, The Recording of the Politician Lajos Kossuth by Ferenc Szabo, Kossuth, A Sketch of a Revolutionist 1 and 2 by John Bassettmore, Kossuth's Speech on Phonograph Cylinders by Boglarka Ilyes, Woman in the 1848 to 1948 Hungarian Revolution by Robert Nemes, Lajos Kossuth and the Permeable American Orient of the Mid-19th Century by Tim Roberts, The Radical Left in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 by Laszlo Dima, God's Playground, A History of Poland, Volume 2 by Norman Davies, and The Hungarian War of Independence in the Southern Region by Olcharvi Odon. And then my primary...
I think right now you've cited more books than I've even read this year.
It's funny that you say that because I've been keeping a spreadsheet of the books I've read, and I'm gonna like to keep track of how many I read per year. And this definitely has inflated my book score. So, primary sources I used are the sixth volume of works by Daniel Webster, published by Little Brown and Company, The Hungarian Declaration of Independence by Lajos Kossuth, Report on the Statistics of Wages in Manufacturing Industries by David Weeks, Statistical View of the United States by James Dunwoody Brownson D. Bow, People of the East by Istvan Zsenecki, Reply by Kossuth, Letter to Kossuth, edited by E.F. Walcott, and Select Speeches of Kossuth by Francis W. Newman. So, as you can probably tell from my sources and pronunciation, the biggest disclaimer I can possibly give is although I am trained in historical research, I only speak English and Spanish, and I am not a historian of Hungary. I've tried to be as accurate as possible to illuminate this largely ignored, at least in the US, history, but alas, not everyone can be an expert in everything. So, without further ado, our story must begin with a very brief outline of two nations during the mid-19th century, the United States of America and the Kingdom of Hungary. And so this is, some of you might disagree with this very simplistic summary I'm giving here of the U.S. history, but, it's just very quick context for people who aren't American. So, the United States of America declared independence from the British Empire in 1776 during the midst of a liberal revolution against monarchism and the British class system. Well, it is completely fair to point out that the American Revolution had two large illiberal characteristics, that is, the genocide of Native Americans and the functional preservation of a widespread slave economy. The nascent American Republic is considered to have been the most comprehensive, largest, and federal republic in the world up to this point in history. So I think there's a misconception that the American Revolution was only political. In particular, Hannah Arendt argued this. But historian Gordon Wood points out in his book Radicalism of the American Revolution that this arises from a misunderstanding of the worldview of early Americans, which did not see a strict separation between politics and economics as conceptual spheres that we see today. This is because in a feudal society, like the early British Empire, there really is not a separation between who has economic and political power, the nobility. Well, even more so than some people might argue nowadays. There's no separation.
Yeah, I was going to say that's kind of the conception of modern power in general.
Yeah, but
is that having economic power continues to instill political power as well.
Yeah, so
I mean, it's an advantage, but it's not like the overwhelming determining factor the same way as it was.
I kind of disagree. I'm not gonna be too certain about that one because it's used now as a mechanism to influence political power, absolutely, but without any kind of economic strength, you can't ascend to any sort of national political level.
It is outside the scope, but it's, the main difference is we're talking about a society where being literally just by your birth, you're given more economic power, etc.
Well, I'll buy that. I will buy that.
It's like it's the same thing just to a greater degree.
And we'll talk later on that one.
Hello, this is Max in Post. I thought that I could better explain how early Americans did not see an epistemological separation between government and economics. So, Good words it as people could not conceive of a society apart from government. The social distinctions and economic deprivations that we today think of as the consequence of class divisions, business exploitation, or various isms, capitalism, racism, etc., were in the 18th century usually thought to be caused by the abuses of government. And so it's not so much that economics isn't determining power, it's just that they did not word it the same way. As an example of this, Wood uses Federalist 62, which was an argument essay written by future President of the United States, James Madison, during the formation of the U.S.'s Constitution. It relates economic oppression very clearly towards government regulation. End quote. Every new regulation concerning commerce or revenue, or in any way affecting the value of the different species of property, presents a new harvest to those who watch the change and can trace its consequences, a harvest reared not by themselves, but by the toils and cares of the great body of their fellow citizens. This is a state of things in which it may be said with some truth that laws are made by the few, not for the many. For a quick comparison, America's 1788 Constitution banned state-recognized titles of nobility, which is something that the UK still has not done in 2025. America's radicalism was also recognized by contemporaries across the Atlantic world. The U.S. Revolution was an inspiration for the Haitian, French, and Latin American revolutions. Within the political sphere, a good example of the U.S.'s liberalism was its complete constitutional separation of church and state. Irish revolutionary Wolfe Tone remarked in 1796 that America has neither king, nobility, nor clergy established by law, and it is notwithstanding, I am satisfied at this hour, the most flourishing and best governed spot on the face of this earth. America, too, had wide religious freedom which extended past Christian religions. Even before its federal codification, future presidents of the United States, James Madison, who wrote the First Amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing religious freedom, and Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the U.S.'s Declaration of Independence, led a successful effort to defeat interpreting religious freedom as only for Christian religions in Virginia. Jefferson stated in his autobiography that this success meant to comprehend that religious freedom held within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian, Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination. These radical sentiments of the American Revolution were still in the public consciousness by the mid-19th century, even as the American Republic in only 60 years of violent colonization spread its de jure control from what is today the U.S. East Coast to pretty much the entire mainland U.S. by 1848. This land spanned over 5,000 kilometers from east to west. Most recently for our timeline, the end of the U.S.-Mexico War in February of 1848 of that year annexed the southwestern U.S. into the country. In addition to the Revolution's memory, other radical movements sprung up in American society. In terms of successful movements, the 1840s saw upstate New York's anti-rent war, which ended the last stronghold of traditional feudalism in the U.S., and Rhode Island's Dorr Rebellion, which resulted in the abolishment of all property requirements to vote in the state. New movements arose as well. 1848 would see the Seneca Falls Convention, sometimes considered the birth of America's feminist movement, and the foundation of the Free Soil Party, which sought the complete prohibition of slavery outside the southern U.S.
I mean, I think it's worth noting, this era, this early 1800s era in America is the emergence of a considerable number of intellectual and political movements, particularly in the American Northeast. So we see not only the movements for women's liberation and integration into society in New York, as you talked about with Seneca Convention, but we also see the emergence of the transcendentalist school of thought, which is an indirect offshoot. It's almost like an American romanticism that has a deep connection with kind of the natural landscape of the country. We see the emergence of revival Methodist movements throughout. Some of these would actually become more famous, and other religious movements and utopian societies emerged all throughout the Northeast in this time. So this was a really experimental time in American history. It was really a crucible for a lot of these ideas. So again, the emergence of intentional communities, the emergence of religious revival movements that in many ways reinterpreted Christianity.
Just for
Which is,
example, the Mormons arose during this time
yeah,
period.
yeah, and like the Mormons are probably the most familiar to most people. They're not exactly the same as some of the other movements that you would see, but these were big deals. Like these were really big deals for American history, especially these religious ones, considering that fellows like Jefferson and Madison, who we talked about earlier, did not actually consider themselves to be Christian. They were very much products of the Enlightenment ideal and deists. They just really believed in kind of like the clockwork nature of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think just another thing that might be useful to state is, for as an example, is some of these religious groups are also very egalitarian and sort of anti-gender norms and statism, such as the Shakers. Although they had their origin was a bit older than this, but that's just around their heyday.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Shakers were definitely just, and like this is a topic for another time, but the Shakers were a variant of the Quakers who go back to the English Civil War. Specifically from this era, we could look at like the Oneida community, which was an intentional community designed on kind of like pure egalitarianism to the point that things such as marriage were essentially outlawed. I mean, you might as well call it the first hippie commune, if you will, if you kind of want to go from the free love idea.
For listeners to this episode, we actually mention and talk about the Shakers in the first episode of our podcast, which is on the history of antinatalism. So you can feel free to go give that a listen as well. There's a nice plug-in we managed to fit in there.
This
But
podcast is sponsored by ourselves. Go watch our
yeah,
other episode.
it's sponsored by the Shaker community, which no longer exists.
I think there are like two of them still.
Actually, three as of this year.
There's
with
three
someone
now.
new joined this
Oh,
year.
nice. Well, I'll be this. Yeah, that's a whole other episode. Let's make that an episode, maybe.
So, across the Atlantic Ocean and east of the Alps, we find the very different land of Hungary. During the late 9th century, nomads from the east settled in the Carpathian Basin, a lush agricultural land fed by the Danube, Europe's second longest river, which stretches from modern-day Germany to Romania. Most importantly, these colonizers brought the Hungarian language into the area. In the year 1000, Hungary officially converted to Christianity and for centuries played a major role in European politics. The Hungarian kingdom comprised the parts of modern-day Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Austria, and the former states of Yugoslavia, with an area of over 280,000 square kilometers. For Americans, that's about the size of Nevada. In 1526, after a disastrous battle against the Ottoman Empire, which saw Hungary's king and the commander-in-chief of their armed forces die in battle, Hungary joined Austria through a union where both countries were ruled autonomously by the Habsburg monarchy. For centuries, a balance was struck between recognizing the increasing absolute rule of the Habsburg monarchs and the rights of the Hungarian nobility. In particular, during the Pragmatic Sanction of 1723, Hungary agreed to change its laws to recognize female Habsburg heirs, and in return the Habsburg emperor reaffirmed the constitutional rights of the Hungarian nobility, which would be codified in 1791. Following the Napoleonic Wars, Hungary was in a position lagging economically behind much of Europe. During the 1840s, coal production rose from 500,000 to 2 million compared to the UK's 65 million, which I know that's kind of an unfair comparison because the UK is literally the best place in the world historically to find coal. But the disparity is still great because there is natural coal and whatnot within the Hungarian kingdom. The Habsburg monarchs, not remembered for their good finances, were in crippling debt. On top of
Were they
this,
remembered for anything other than their lip?
They were really good at like incest. I remember that. That's like that's like how I remember them.
Yeah, that's where the lip came from.
the main thing I was hinting at was the Habsburg rulers of Spain ended up part of the reason why the Spanish Empire collapsed was because they just kept on printing money more or less and just hyperinflation went up. Oh, on top of this, Hungary's largely agricultural economy sputtered with the end of Napoleon's protectionist continental system as local production struggled to compete with outside imports. Direct taxes on land were 50% of the monarchy's revenue, the rest coming from duties and sales taxes. Spending was almost split into thirds between defense, administration, and debt payments. To paint a picture of Hungarian society during the 1840s, the 5.4 million ethnic Hungarians made up less than 4/10 of the Kingdom of Hungary's population. The largest minorities were German speakers, speakers of Slavic languages, and Romanians. Different regions had different levels of autonomy, ranging from Hungary, which had its own legislative diet, to the southern military frontier on the Ottoman border, where the Habsburg military ruled directly. Traditionally, Latin was the language of politics and German was the language of military communication. Women lacked property and political rights and were denied access to professions and university.
Yeah, going back, it's pronounced diet.
Isn't it diet?
I'm pretty sure it's diet, but I could be wrong. Give me a second.
It's not an episode of this podcast without a correction of Max's
That's
pronunciation.
fair. I'm looking. I'm looking at the IPA right now. No, it is diet. Yeah, it's the same sound as pie, apparently. Yeah.
You mean P?
No, the I in P in pie. Yeah, that's why the diet of worms is so funny because it looks like the diet of worms. So why would eating a bunch of worms like help you establish like religious unity? All right, I'll shut up now.
Which I thought part of the joke was that it wasn't actually pronounced diet, though. That's like that's what I thought, anyways. But
The worms will take over your brain and make you worship the same religion. While we're talking about like funny sounding things that like are pronounced wrong, I think a military themed strip. There's someone should make a military themed strip club named Horse Day Combat.
thank you, Otto.
Oh, lordy. Oh, lordy, lordy. All right,
You can edit this one out.
we might have to.
Women lacked property, political rights, and were denied access to the professions and university. Since the 1830s, however, women had limited participation in public life, especially through participating in the press and charitable organizations. Workdays for commoners could be 15 hours long. Hungary's political nation was defined as the Natio Ungarica, consisting of the nobility, clergy, and burghers of free cities. And for reference, burgher in this context means someone who lives in a city, not the food. While the misera plebs contribuens, or poor taxpayers, weren't seen as fully part of the Hungarian nation. 5% of Hungary's population were nobles, some of the largest numbers in Europe. To compare, Bohemia's, it was 0.1% of the population, and it was 2% of the population in Galicia. Some counties could be 25% noble, with entire villages claiming to be nobles. 90% of the population, regardless of status, were agriculturalists. Rights of nobles included habeas corpus, owning feudal domains, freedom from serving the king except in arms, and exemption from monetary taxes. Nobles were on paper legally equal, but divided into two estates. The first were the baronets, a few hundred families with Austrian titles, two-thirds of whom were not ethnic Hungarians and held the highest state offices, including having the right to sit in the upper house of the Diet. The second were the lower nobles, who controlled the lower house and were usually servicing more daily bureaucratic positions. One baron family, the Esterházys, alone had a territory about as large as the U.S. state of Rhode Island or the size of two Bahrains. The opposite end included nobles who, despite their social status, worked the field like a serf and had to pay dues to richer nobles. Noble strongholds for county governments were all positions, but the crown-appointed governor were elected by the nobility. Peasants were legally tied to the lord's land and had to work it under him. However, they were protected from being evicted and due certain rights from their lord, including a small old age pension, as well as funding in response to natural disasters. By this time, the enclosure of the commons enacted by the 1832 Diet came into full force, as rich landowners shifted into relying on sheep pastures to sell wool in lieu of growing food, which could not compete with foreign imports. However, wool also turned out to be unable to compete with foreign imports, leading to not only many peasants losing their land, but nobles losing their wealth. Peasants began performing work slowdowns and sabotage and resistance. As in other countries, enclosure sparked urbanization. The largest city, Pest's population rose from 64,000 in 1840 to over 100,000 by 1848. Industry in the proletariat grew as well, but relatively slow for Hungary's size. Austria had 15 times as many steam engines, 6 times the iron production, and only 10% of the empire's capitalist enterprises were in Hungary. The first train line would be installed in 1846. Most of this growth came from foreign investors. But towards the end of the 1840s, an economic downturn hit Europe. For reference, this is about the same time as the infamous Irish potato famine. Half of Austria's factory workers lost their jobs, and the price of potatoes in Vienna quadrupled. So I bet you're wondering, how does the US and Hungary cross paths? Well, the answer is the year 1848, which saw liberal revolutions erupt across most of Europe, including in Hungary, which we'll get into in much more detail.
Yeah, that was the year everything happened.
And I think one thing that some people who are like vaguely aware of sort of, say, communists and different socialist histories might be interested in knowing is that this revolutions of 1848 are kind of the origin of why people thought, a universal revolution could be possible, because pretty much everywhere from France to, Eastern Europe was having revolutions all at the same time in the exact same year.
Yeah, I mean the great irony of it is that they were all put down. To none of them succeeded to the level that we expected, or that I say we, the number that the participants expected to. And we see some really interesting characters kind of come out of this disillusioned or having completely changed their mechanisms of understanding the world. I mean, even like we could look at a very interesting historical figure like Richard Wagner, who was a massive participant in the revolutions. His mindset and his virulence and his hatred of some groups, his anti-Semitism, and when I say hatred of some groups, I mean liberals and non-liberals alike. These all become exaggerated post 1848 when he's forced to flee. I think it's Dresden, and resettle in Switzerland and then eventually Paris for a while. It's like, this is like, if you know anything about that era of time, that is the year that everything changes in Europe. And it really reasserts that, like, no, institutional power is what's going to remain, and all the revolutionary ideas start to fragment into more camps, but they still work with each other, and they still develop actually some of the better ideas afterward.
Americans enthusiastically watched the 1848 revolutions, with frequent calls for the U.S. to support republicanism in Europe. Most optimistically, the New York Tribune, led by the socialist Horace Greeley, predicted that all of Europe would become one unified republic similar to the United States. The U.S. Congress passed a resolution congratulating France on adopting a Republican government, passing the Senate unanimously as its main critic. Former Vice President John Calhoun withdrew himself. Though skeptical of what came next, even Calhoun was still convinced that progress had outgrown European monarchism. The revolutions of 1848 became a rallying cry for American interventionism. Americans viewed the Hungarian Revolution naively as a crusade for liberty and republicanism. A company of volunteers was mustered in New York to fight for the Hungarians. President Zachary Taylor received an assault of calls to recognize the independence of Hungary, including from former Vice President George Dallas, Chief Justice Joseph Hornblower of the New Jersey Supreme Court, and mass meetings of citizens. One such meeting was even proposed by future President of the United States Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois.
I just want to say what a cool last name Hornblower is.
I mean, dude, you ever read the Horatio Hornblower stories?
No.
Oh, and you're like a naval history guy. Like, geez.
I know all of my naval history from an anime phone game, okay?
Oh, my God. Touche. But, it's like... No, those are famous. Like, I had a buddy go into the Navy because of that.
Tim Roberts notes that Hungary was able to play this inspirational role since, in Americans' mind, Hungary was a poorly understood liminal place that wasn't easily put into either the West or the Orient. Americans knew very little about Hungary other than it was somewhere in Europe having a liberal revolution against monarchism. Now, it will be a while before we return to the US, but I promise that if we all stay the course, that the level of shenanigans that happens is going to be more than worth it. Turning back the clock a little, and 9 pages into my script, we return to the main character of my narrative. Kossuth was born on September 19, 1802, in the village of Monok in the region of Zemplén, near the border of modern-day Hungary and Slovakia. Zemplén is more or less rural wine country, and the modern town still has fewer than 2,000 people. His family moved between several small towns in the region. Kossuth's father came from the lower nobility, working as a lawyer for a wealthier noble family. His mother was a German-speaking burgher. Coming from a Lutheran family, Kossuth attended a Lutheran high school where he graduated as the valedictorian. Kossuth's family spoke 3 languages at home: Hungarian, German, and Slovak. He attended a Calvinist college notable for teaching in Hungarian instead of Latin, which was the language of Hungarian academia at the time. In 1820, he graduated from the college after 1 year of studies at the age of 18, which I don't actually know if this is true, but I'm assuming his college degree was much shorter than what they currently are in 2025. He moved to the country's capital, Budapest, which at the time was technically 3 separate cities. Budapest had Hungary's only full university, its largest press, the National Library, National Museum, and National Theatre. Kossuth practiced as a legal assistant for a few years before passing the bar exam in 1823. Failing to run an independent...
So wait, sorry to interrupt, but I didn't know it was called the bar exam in other countries.
That's just the generic name for that type of exam, I believe, at least in American English.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the bar is just the organization that controls how law is regulated, more or less.
So it's the certification of lawyers, basically, anywhere you go.
Failing to run an independent practice, Kossuth left Budapest in 1824 to work for his father. In his free time as a young adult, Kossuth enjoyed reading about historical theory. He rejected the Bible's accuracy and wrote a sympathetic account of the French Revolution, though did not go as far as supporting the terror. His adult appearance was described as having a tiny frame, neatly trimmed beard, high forehead, and sad eyes under bushy eyebrows. In 1825, Habsburg Emperor Franz I decided to hold the first Hungarian Diet in over a decade. It was a bid to approve higher tax rates which were independently levied in Hungary. Hungarian liberals proved to be an influential faction in the Diet, demanding Hungarian to be used in public schools and an end of an internal tariff which separated Hungary's market from the rest of the Habsburg Empire. The crown often used the threat of giving more rights to the peasantry to temper the nobility's fervor. By the time the Diet ended in 1827, it was agreed to tax lower nobles who worked the land like serfs, hold a census, and for there to be a crown investigation into the viability of reform. In 1830, the emperor held a new diet to raise tax and troop levies in response to the July Revolution in France, which overthrew the current king and established a constitutional monarchy. Kossuth by this point successfully climbed the ladder in his rural county, going from a city attorney to sitting on Zemplin's assembly. He'd enter national politics for the first time as a delegate to the 1830 Diet. The Diet agreed to higher troop levies in exchange for minor support for the Hungarian language. We're going to get some escalation here. In 1831, a cholera outbreak struck Zemplin and the crown closed its borders. A conspiracy theory broke out that Jews were using the quarantine to expand enclosure for sheep pastures. Peasant-led pogroms targeting Jews began. Kossuth helped organize hospitals and a militia to defend nobles from the peasants. Soon, wanton violence from both sides broke out until imperial troops intervened. The legacy of 1831 would be that a generation of Hungarian nobles saw peasant violence against their class for the first time in person.
So, like, when we talk about wanton violence, we're talking about, like, the dumplings, right?
Yes. And in the way that someone might just smash down a bunch of dumplings, peasants were smashing in the heads of nobility.
It's good to know. Although, I think in this part of the world they call them pierogi.
They were in Hungary, so they probably call them something completely different.
Probably. I mean, my people call them vareniki, so here we are.
I was actually on like the Wikipedia page for the Hungarian language, and it turns out there was like debate over whether or not it was a Slavic language for a while.
Huh. I mean, I guess I could see that because it would be heavily influenced.
Yeah, the main argument for it is because it's like bordered by a bunch of Slavic countries, so of course it is going to like borrow a bunch of words from Slavic languages, and that's why people like for a while it considered it to be a Slavic language.
Okay.
But yeah, isn't its grammar and other stuff completely different?
Yeah. Its taxonomy is based off of ancestry anyway, so even if it was the same, it'd still be considered Uralic. In addition to his administrative endeavors, Kossuth gained a gambling addiction. A notable case of this was when Kossuth sat on a commission formed by Zemplin's orphan court to examine the estate of a peasant's revolt victim. In his role, he sold 17 barrels of wine cheaply to a Jewish merchant without providing the money to the commission. Noble corruption was often overlooked, but being a vocal liberal had garnered Kossuth many enemies, and a commission to investigate his corruption was formed. Kossuth took on more debt to pay back what he had stolen, convincing the commission to only conclude that he had an immoral character and fire him from his job, opposed to something like jailing him. Liberal allies intervened to save his career and appointed him a non-voting representative on their behalf to a new diet which had been called for 1832. Kossuth swore off gambling and drinking, though, as we will see when he goes to America, personal finances were never really Kossuth's strong suit. Nevertheless, Kossuth quickly became so absorbed into politics that he was noted as having no love life. The 1832 Diet, which ran into 1836, was dominated by discussions of a book published by the wealthy noble István Széchenyi. Széchenyi convincingly claimed that Hungary's poor agriculture was due to serfdom and that paying workers would increase productivity. He denounced the
What a
special
thought.
Yes. He denounced the special rights of nobles, collectively owned commons, guilds, and most aspects of feudalism. What followed was a flurry of liberal reforms, further enclosure of the commons, nobles now had to pay the toll on Budapest-Danube Bridge, and the state could expropriate noble land for railroads. The Diet also elevated Hungarian to the primary administrative language across Hungary. When Kossuth showed up to the assembly, he broke with tradition and gave a speech as a non-voting representative. Kossuth argued that the Diet should publish its proceedings and defend freedom of the press. Being an absolute nobody from a rural part of the country, no one reacted to his speech. Kossuth sat back down from embarrassment. However, his speech seems to have been successful, and the leadership began writing summaries of the Diet's proceedings. Kossuth spread doctored versions of said proceedings through a pro-liberal subscription-based mailing letter that had 334 editions. He was essentially an influencer. The Diet intervened to restrain his publishing by confiscating his lithograph machine, but did not bar him from continuing at a slower pace. This experience gave him an insight to understanding Hungarian politics and also gave him his first real national notoriety. In response to Polish nationalism, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed a Holy Trinity alliance in 1833 against domestic and foreign enemies aimed at promoting conservative monarchism. We'll keep a pin on that for later. In 1835, Emperor Franz died and was replaced by his epileptic son Ferdinand. To aid his governance, a conservative state conference was formed of various high-ranking politicians. The state conference included Chancellor Clemens von Metternich, Czech Count Franz Anton Kolowrat-Lebensteinsky, and formally Archduchess Sophia of Bavaria became a royal advisor. Count Kolowrat and Archduchess Sophia would steer the conference to adopt a harsh Hungarian policy. Hungarian liberals were subjected to political prosecution. In 1839, Miklós Weselny, leader of the opposition in the Diet, became the highest level arrest during the period. In 1836, Kossuth moved to Budapest and founded a journal called Municipal Reports about Hungary's counties. His publications became increasingly radical, and in 1837 he was arrested for sedition. Kossuth quickly became a national martyr. Mass protests in support of him broke out, and since in Hungarian law a noble could only be arrested if caught in the act of a crime, they put Kossuth into essentially house arrest. And I would just have to say, is it kind of like an amazing law to have? That like someone literally has to be caught in the act to be tried? But anyways. He was allowed to contact the outside world, and Kossuth used this time to learn English based on a translation of the Bible and Shakespeare. And yes, that did affect his accent. 1839 saw a new Diet, where the new leader of the opposition, Ferenc Diák, managed to win some liberal gains. These included the release of liberal prisoners, the legalization of private factories, which undermined feudal guilds, letting serfs purchase their lands, regulations on child labor, and letting Jews legally take part in trade and industry. Hungarian was also strengthened as Hungary's administrative language, extending to royal petitions. Common documents like birth certificates and Hungarian regiments were permitted to speak Hungarian instead of German. In 1830, authorities released Kossuth. He immediately started another national scandal by marrying Teretz the day of his release. Teretz Kossuth was a poor Catholic noblewoman, and the local Catholic archbishop in Budapest had ordered that conversion was necessary for mixed marriages. Kossuth refused to become Catholic. Kossuth was defended by Pest County, which declared the archbishop's order illegal, and Kossuth managed to find a priest who issued him a marriage certificate on January 9th, 1841. Then another boon fell right into Kossuth's lap. For unknown reasons, Chancellor Metternich had a police agent arrange for Kossuth to become the head of a press in Budapest in an effort to contain him. The ploy had the opposite effect, becoming a radical paper read by thousands. Kossuth's press advocated for liberal reforms, including turning land and labor into marketable commodities, ideally in a self-governing capitalist and monolinguistic Hungarian state led by the nobility. Kossuth demanded that the state force nobles to free their peasants with compensation for their loss, and the end to the nobility's exemption from taxation as had occurred elsewhere in the Habsburg monarchy. Kossuth's press spoke against corporal punishment and advocated for infrastructure improvements such as new railroads, new orphanages, and new children's hospitals. By this time, Kossuth was notable enough to catch Senecsi's attention. He condemned Kossuth by arguing that Hungary's conditions were not similar to Anglo-Saxon capitalist countries, meaning that Kossuth's liberal reforms would lead to a class and race wars. He writes of Hungarians that, and this is Otto's quote,
I was ready to transition, and then you messed me up by saying, and this is Otto's quote.
"We're sorry."
This was the only thing I've been locked into this whole time. That and the map on your slideshow. That wondering where how all those German speakers got those places. Our element is not commercial preeminence or a desire for glory and fame, nor a passion for contemplation arising from religion, or the circle of fine arts, or diving into the high and soaring sciences, and the like. Constitutional freedom and elevated nationality are our elements. This is the fountain from which everything must flow. Revolution is the most dangerous, deadly disease for us, and national life is the supreme goal. But let us reform ourselves without a crisis that causes instability, and in this respect, the battle has already been somewhat won. If now, due to the excessive fire of some national chess players, not everything will be lost again.
As you can tell, Zanetti is very much the sort of liberal moderate, sort of I want reforms but not a revolution guy, right? A few months later, Kossuth published his reply condemning moderation as not enough. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a translation for Kossuth's reply, but historian István Diák notes that one of the main wedges between conservatives and radicals in Hungary at the time was the nationality question. Conservatives and moderates, like Zsenice, were more tolerant of the Habsburg monarchy's diverse nationalities, hence warning that there would be a race war. Liberals like Kossuth wanted minority customs to be limited to private life. Most harshly, Kossuth claimed that Slovakians had no history of being a nation, as they lacked a distinguishable territory and therefore deserved no autonomy. Most sympathetically,
Ooh, shots fired.
yes, we're getting into some good Eastern Europe racism here. Most sympathetically and controversially among his peers, Kossuth advocated for Croatians to be separated from Hungary and elevated to its own kingdom within the Habsburg Empire. A worry across Hungary was that pan-Slavic nationalism would consume the nation. Kossuth predicted a Central and Western European anti-Slav alliance would one day defeat the Slavs led by Russia from dominating Europe. In fact, part of why he advocated for new railroads was to build one connecting Hungary to the sea so that foreign troops could quickly arrive to defend Hungary from Russia. Another wedge Dieck points out is that Zsenice believed that Hungary needed to develop its capitalist economy before enacting political reforms. Well, Kossuth thought that political liberalization could go hand in hand with economic liberalization. In 1843, a new diet was called. In wake of having their tax-exempt status removed, the sandaled nobles, who worked the land like serfs, committed acts of political violence against the reform-minded politicians. The 1843 to 1844 Diet in general would be chaotic, but managed to declare Hungarian as the official language of Hungary for the first time in the nation's history. Again, in a country where less than 4/10 of the population spoke Hungarian. In 1844, Chancellor Metternich decided to stop funding Kossuth's press. István Diák alleges that Kossuth met with Metternich and refused an offer by the Chancellor to buy him out. Kossuth became a writer for a trade journal writing economic theory. Kossuth's main contribution was becoming a voice for the industrialization of Hungary and the establishment of a capitalist class. Kossuth sent agents to London and Paris to study their economy. In 1846, after failing to build a railroad from Budapest to the sea, Kossuth returned to politics. Around this time, Chancellor Metternich identified the primary problems with Hungary: a large liberal opposition, the autonomy of the counties, and the oppression of the peasants and non-Hungarians. Metternich had one Count Emil Disify from the Hungarian Conservative Party, joined by Zanetti, to create the country's first-ever cabinet. 1846 saw a separate noble and peasant revolt break out in Austrian Galicia. As an aside, Austrian Galicia was known as one of the worst governed regions in Europe, with one historian, Norman Davies, going as far as claiming that conditions were worse in Ireland during the potato famine.
And that's where my people are from.
Yes, that's why I mentioned when I was spinning this to you that Galicia does come up.
Of course you did. It was like the peasant capital of the universe. It was great.
By 1887, 50,000 people died every year in a territory of 6 million people. From 1893 to 1914, over 2 million people left. Worried about rural nobility joining liberal nobles in the city of Krakow, the Austrian government intentionally supported the 1846 peasant revolt. Things quickly erupted out of the Habsburg government's control as peasants killed over 1,000 nobles. Some districts in Galicia saw 90% of the noble estates destroyed. Violence continued for 2 months before the imperial military put it down. As for Hungary, Chancellor Metternich thought that Galicia showed that the crown could divide peasants and nobility within the same nationality. 1847 saw yet another diet convene in what is today modern Bratislava. This time Metternich sought to undermine the Hungarian liberal nobility by passing reforms freeing the peasants as part of the conservatives' agenda. In the lead-up to the Diet, Kossuth formed his own political party, dubbed the United Opposition Party. Kossuth represented the municipalist faction, which sought to keep Hungary organized around noble counties. A more radical faction of centralists wanted a stronger national government instead. Ferenc Diak and Kossuth played a major role in drafting the opposition party's liberal platform. Their platform was banned by the government and had to be distributed clandestinely. They demanded 1. National sovereignty within the Habsburg monarchy, 2. Unification of all lands under the Hungarian crown, 3. Socioeconomic progress, who can disagree with that one, 4. A Bill of Rights, 5. Hungarian as the sole language of instruction, 6. Freedom of press and religion, 7. Increased suffrage, 8. General taxation, 9. Equality before the law, and 10. An end to peasant servitude. In October, Kossuth ran for election in Pest County. The Conservative Party mobilized both the Catholic Church and secret police to work against his election. One conservative official in Pest reflected their party sentiments well when he remarked,
Kossuth is an agitator and not a peaceable and quiet character as has been recommended by His Gracious Majesty in his letter of convocation. He is the kind who alone will cause more trouble than the rest of the Diet combined.
Kossuth supporters, largely nobles, donned peasant dress as they championed through the streets. This provided awkward images such as noblewomen who still wore diamonds on their modest fabrics. Nevertheless, Kossuth managed to win his election with 69% of the vote. Across Hungary, a secret police report found that 21 counties were loyal to the Habsburgs, 8 counties could be persuaded, and that 14 were solidly within the liberal opposition. A factor supporting Kossuth's election in Pest was that the 1847 Diet election had expanded enfranchisement to include educated commoners like city teachers. Turnout was also low, leading to the election being dominated by liberal zealots. Only around 4,000 people voted, despite the eligible male nobility alone creating a pool of over 14,000 voters. King Ferdinand opened the Kingdom of Hungary's Diet on November 11th. His speech threw in some Hungarian, snubbing the Croatians who insisted on communicating in the neutral language of Latin. The king proposed legislation reflecting some reform demands, as well as a removal of the custom barrier between Austria and Hungary. Subsequently, the Diet became gridlocked by debates surrounding how they should proceed with discussions. It was broken by Kossuth's suggestion that the lower house not address the throne directly yet, but rather discuss issues freely without adopting an official agenda until later. The early stages of the Diet slightly favored the conservatives. For instance, Kossuth's suggestion to end crown-appointed county heads lost 24 to 23 in February. Often the deciding factor were the Croatian counties. International events erupted as a deus ex machina to save Hungary's opposition party. In January, a liberal revolution broke out in Sicily, which quickly spread up the Italian peninsula towards the Habsburg holdings in northern Italy. The crown decided to commit to a defense of its Italian holdings despite its tight budget. On February 29th, a Prussian diplomat provided Austria with this account of events.
Every day the Italian mail brings news of constitutions, rebellions, and political murders. To see Metternich weak, deaf, reduced to a shadow, senile, is to make one sense that he will not have the strength to brave the storm. I saw the emperor recently at a court ball. I would never have believed him in such a terrible condition. The Empress spends all her time with her confessor, but she will not pray away the trouble. Archduchess Sophie cries the whole day. It seems that she is the only one to sense the danger. Bankruptcy is upon us. The 30 million gulden sent by the Russians is a drop in the bucket. The fact that no one buys tobacco or plays the lottery has caused a deficit of 10 million gulden in the Italian provinces alone. The army in Italy costs 3 million gulden monthly. Today, everyone is talking about the resignation of Louis Philippe. Will this bring peace? Only a war can save Austria and Germany now.
Metternich himself wrote the same day.
We are looking forward to the most horrible events. The world is being taught a grave lesson.
When news of French King Louis Philippe's resignation reached Vienna and Bratislava, the political climate changed in an instant. A withdrawal panic shook Viennese banks on March 1st, and 2 days later, Kossuth gave a speech to the Diet, seen as the beginning of the 1848 revolutions in the Habsburg monarchy at large, and in Hungary in particular. Kossuth demanded liberal reforms, saying, "The dynasty must choose between its own welfare and the preservation of a rotten system." Here's an excerpt of his speech.
I express my conviction that the future constitutional existence of our country could only be secured by our king surrounding himself with constitutional forms of government throughout his dominions. Since I pronounce these words, thrones sustained by statecraft have fallen, and nations which, but a few months back, could not have dreamed of the proximity of such an event, and have recovered their freedom. But we, for the space of 3 months, have incessantly rolled the stone of Sisyphus, and my soul is oppressed with a feeling akin to despair to think that we should remain thus immovable. The suffocating vapor of a heavy curse hangs over us, and out of the charnel house of the cabinet of Vienna a pestilential wind sweeps by, benumbing our senses and exerting a deadening effect on our national spirit. When political changes occur, and the time for a peaceable adjustment has passed away, when the die is irrevocably cast and we have neglected to give utterance to the free and loyal sentiments of representatives of the people, when matters have become so entangled that we have only to choose between submission and the sacrifices whose end God alone can foresee, then will repentance come too late, and the Omnipotent himself cannot restore moments wasted in inaction. If I, as a patriot, must share in this tardy repentance, I will at least not fail my duty as a delegate.
And so I think personally, you might not agree with his political views, etc., but I think you can see why his speeches were convincing to people in terms of its fairly strong rhetoric being used.
I mean, that's got the pathos behind it right there.
I am adding pestilential to my personal vocabulary.
We increase Otto's vocabulary through the podcast.
As long as you can do it pestilentially, we'll be fine.
Oh, I just realized that's a horrible pun. Pestilentially, like the city in Hungary.
So should we say it's like Buddha pestilentially? That sounds good to me.
Buddha pestilentially. There, I did more than 4-syllable words. I deserve a cookie.
Kossuth closed his speech by reading his proposed representation to the king. It declared that necessary reforms in Hungary could be accomplished only by means of a majoritarian national government in Hungary. On March 4th, the lower house of the Diet enthusiastically adopted Kossuth's demands as their official address to the throne. It was temporarily stalled in the upper house, but was forced through when the lower house threatened to break with tradition and present their throne address without going through the upper nobility's chamber. As we talk about ensuing events, István Diák makes a compelling point of view for why Hungary so easily took to revolutionary legislation. Unlike other non-sovereign nationalities, Hungary had its own diet, administration, a relatively large politically engaged social class, and a well-regarded liberal leader. Furthermore, Diák blames Metternich's attempts at preventing revolution as too slow. Diák also takes a negative view towards Kossuth, however. He contends that Kossuth cared little about the opinions of others and instigated an ensuing crisis through his determination, caring mostly about immediate problems instead of long-term goals. Ultimately, he argues Janecki was right and Kossuth was wrong. Hungary ought not have embarked on its great political adventure without first having developed economic strength in a bourgeois society. This is since the nobility's revolution was built on the fragile grounds of a small class and a small nationality. On March 9th, a poet named Sandor Petofi and his followers in the opposition party started rewriting Kossuth's demands to be seen as a popular petition during a fair to be held on March 19th in Budapest, where 40,000 peasants are expected to visit the city. Petofi's version of Kossuth's reforms included further demands such as jury trials, a popularly elected Hungarian parliament, freedom of press, religious equality, and a Hungarian military. On March 13th, students and workers fully revolted in Vienna, destroying factories, getting into clashes with the military, and even giving readings of Kossuth's speech. The monarchy responded by coupping the Metternich government. The chancellor himself would exile to England. Over the next couple days, censorship was lifted, and Emperor Ferdinand promised a new constitution, and the upper house agreed to convene immediately in Austria. On March 15th, Hungary's Diet voted to pass all of Kossuth's policies and demand a Hungarian prime minister be appointed. In Budapest, Petofi's followers read their demands, followed by a national poem written by Petofi in a cafe. From there, they gathered a crowd at Pest University to seize the printing press that had previously fired Kossuth. At 1500, a crowd of 10,000 people gathered in the rain to hear Petofi give a speech in the National Museum. The crowd stormed City Hall to form a committee of public safety, which I just want to point out has the nicely fitting acronym in English of COPS. A revolutionary government would now govern Budapest under a liberal coalition and set up a national guard.
Yeah, wasn't that the same name that Robespierre gave his committee?
I'm not sure if it was. I think public safety was definitely in the name now that you say that, but I don't know if it was also literally it.
Yeah, I think it was. It might not be the exact same thing, but I think it was pretty close to that. Some good foreshadowing there for the world.
And most of the people here, I believe, who were revolutionaries were familiar with the French Revolution. Like, as we saw, Kossuth himself wrote a sympathetic, history of it as, some edgy, nerdy young adult in his free time. A revolutionary government would now govern Budapest under a liberal coalition and set up a national guard. That afternoon, a delegation of the Bratislava Diet boarded steamboats to submit their address to the king. The Diet members en route decided to write the king's response in advance, Kossuth penning it that night for Ferdinand's signature. They demanded the liberal Count Battani form a cabinet and appoint Archduke Stefan as royal plenipotentiary in Hungary, and have the king accept all reforms proposed by the Diet under Stefan's leadership. They arrived in Vienna wearing national dress, including bedazzled swords and feathered caps, to a celebratory crowd of up to 100,000 Viennese. Citizens removed the horses from Kossuth's carriage and pulled it by hand, stopping again and again to force Kossuth to give speeches, which, for reference, he did not want to be giving. On March 16th, Archduke Stefan stressed to his family that they needed to accept Hungary's demands to prevent them from seceding from the Habsburg Empire. Emperor Ferdinand, pale-faced and ailing, received the Hungarians at noon. He managed a mumbled acknowledgement. Following this, the state conference met in the Hofburg Palace till dawn. Aghast at the demands, they decided to give in due to lack of positive prospects. They were also moved by the news that 40,000 peasants were gathering in Pest in what was surely a revolt. And again, that was just a regular market fair. The state conference published their reply on the 17th. They agreed to all demands but two. They removed Battani's name and that they would unconditionally follow the Diet. Upset at the changes, Stefan rushed to the king and convinced Ferdinand to orally accede to appointing Battani as prime minister, going around the state conference. The state conference ruled that Stefan had overstepped his role, but temporarily upheld his role on the 18th. The Hungarian Diet began drafting their new constitution. Kossuth would lead the proposal, starting with allowing non-voting Diet members such as the clergy and burghers votes. The Diet soon approved taxation of the nobility, the abolishment of all feudal duties, and the abolishment of compulsory church tithes. Thus the stage was set. In the midst of revolutionary fervor spreading across Europe, Kossuth and the Hungarian nobility had managed the unthinkable. Legal sanction from the conservative Habsburg monarchy to form a revolutionary government.